Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, hi everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm Tom O'Halloran. I'm an assistant professor in forestry and environmental conservation, and I work at the Baruch Institute in Georgetown. I just wanted to start by welcoming Dr. Anderegg and thanking him for joining us today. We're very excited to have him. This was Lucas Clay's idea. Lucas is a graduate student that works with me. And so I also wanted to thank Lucas and introduce him, and he will introduce Dr. Anderegg. Lucas is hot off of an airplane, so as far as I understand it, he's actually sitting in an airport somewhere right now, but hopefully we'll be able to hear Lucas. Oh, and he's going to turn on his camera, it looks like even. Nice, and great. So take it away, Lucas. Thanks again, Dr. Anderegg, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And on behalf of the O'Halloran Lab, I'd like to welcome Dr. William Anderegg. He received his bachelor's and Ph.D. from Stanford University in 2013. He was a NOAA Climate and Global Change Postdoctoral Fellow at Princeton University before joining the University of Utah. He's an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Utah, and his group studies how drought and climate change affects forest ecosystems, including tree physiology, species interactions, carbon cycling, and biosphere-atmosphere feedbacks. This research spans a broad array of spatial scales from xylem cells to ecosystems and seeks to gain a better mechanistic understanding of how climate change will affect forests around the world. Despite finishing his PhD only 8 years ago, Dr. Anderegg has already published over 100 papers, including more than 20 papers in top journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the Nature family of journals, and Science. We're very pleased to have Dr. Anderegg as our speaker today. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, yeah, thank you, Lucas, and thanks for that great introduction. And thank you all for the invitation to be here virtually with you today. I'm excited to share some of the work we've been doing and some of the questions we've been thinking about. Before I jump into some of the context of the talk and the background, just a bit of housekeeping in that I feel like oftentimes when I attend these virtual seminars, there's this awkward floating head talking at the same time, and it is interrupting a lot of times with the content. So in my slides, I've created a specific space for my face so that you can, if you're on a single screen, you can click and drag me there, and I won't block anything else in the slide. So just a quick note there. That's what this gray square is. So what I want to do today is basically do a brief background and introduction of why this matters for a lot of things we might care about, and then give you kind of an overview of the types of work that we do in my group, really thinking about three central themes about tree ecophysiology of climate and stress responses, how we scale that up to ecosystems, and then how we can scale that in time towards longer term predictions and projections. I'll tell about one main vignette in each of these sections. And then finally, I'll wrap up with a few of the things we're thinking about in the future. So of course, one of the big drivers here and some of the context is that driven by human activities and emissions of fossil fuels, CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere and causing climate change. What's kind of cool though, so this is this very famous iconic Keeling curve, is that not only do we see that CO2 is going up year over year, and that's very, very clear in the Keeling curve, but actually we can see the imprint of plant physiology globally and plant and ecosystem gas exchanges in that. You can see this has this Keeling curve has this classic sawtooth pattern that is really over the course of the year tracking the cumulative or the combined photosynthesis and respiration from ecosystems across the globe, that as especially where the landmass is concentrated in the northern hemisphere, as the growing season kicks off in the northern hemisphere, we see CO2 drop by about 4 to 5 parts per million in the atmosphere. And then over the winter, as a lot of that respiration and decomposition happens, it creeps back up. So we can actually see this plant ecophysiology and ecosystem dynamics in our atmospheric concentrations. What's also really incredible is that actually plant climate stress matters globally as well. So this is a really nice paper in Nature that came out a couple of years ago from Vincent Humphrey and colleagues. And what I'm about to show you on this graph is on the y-axis is the CO2 growth rate in the atmosphere. So that is literally how much CO2 grows year over year in this Keeling curve. And on the x-axis is total land water storage assessed via this GRACE satellite. And it goes from drier at -1 to wetter at 1.5. And what you can see is there's an incredibly strong relationship, a correlation at least, between drier and wetter conditions on land and how much CO2 sticks around in the atmosphere. When the land is on average drier, a lot more CO2 stays in the atmosphere. And when the land is on average wetter, a lot more CO2 gets sucked out of the atmosphere by terrestrial plants. So this tells us actually that plant responses to climate and climate stress, in this case, water availability, matters so much we can also see it at a global scale in the atmosphere. Another motivating for this factor, of course, is that as the climate changes, we're expecting more climate extremes. And this is a nice visualization of some of the prominent extremes we're expecting to see in different parts of the US. We've certainly seen that in spades this summer and this fall already. And in substantial parts, like where I'm based in Utah and a lot of the Western US, more droughts and more fires are a really prominent example of climate extremes. Let's put some actual projections and numbers on that. So this is a projection of a pretty prominent drought index called SPEI. And the darker brown colors are indicating drying, more frequent and more severe droughts, and the blue colors are indicating wetting in this drought index. And this is the end of century projection from a whole set of climate models in a high emissions climate scenario. And the gray little crosses you can see on this are indicating where there's a lot of model agreement in the trends. And what you can see is over huge swaths of Earth's surface and in really almost every major biome, we're expecting in many regions more frequent and more severe drought conditions. And some areas in particular really pop out. So the southwestern United States, Northern Africa and the Mediterranean, Australia, and potentially parts of South America really jump out as hot spots of more frequent and more severe droughts expected in a rapidly changing climate. It's also pretty clear just in the past decade or two that climate change is already pushing forests past the brink of survival. This is a picture of spruce forests in Colorado, and it's actually I like to say when I'm talking to a lot of different audiences here in the West that you can almost see this on every single mountain highway that you drive. That every single mountain pass that you drive, you see these widespread forest die-off events that are triggered. You see fire scars, but a lot of these are also triggered by drought and by pests and pathogens like bark beetles. This is a beetle outbreak here. So we're left with this fundamental scientific question about what is the future of Earth's forests in the 21st century. And it's really this tug of war between two opposing sets of drivers. On one hand, we think that rising CO2 concentrations ought to directly benefit plant physiology and perhaps drive more growth than death and a general greening of forests and forest health. On the other hand, the stresses and disturbances that come with climate change, so temperature, drought, fire, pests and pathogens, storms like hurricanes, these are pretty damaging to forests and may cause more death than growth. And this is this tug of war between two opposing sets of drivers. The future is still remarkably uncertain among these drivers, and understanding when and where these different drivers are going to dominate is critically important for a huge number of things that we care about, for conservation of biodiversity, for land management, for ecosystem services that these forests provide. And just as an example of the uncertainty in the future of Earth's forests, here is a nice summary of some of these large-scale ecosystem and global vegetation models. This is showing you the change in land carbon storage over the 21st century. So the y-axis here is petagrams of carbon, and positive numbers mean a net uptake of carbon, and negative numbers mean a net loss of carbon, which of course would accelerate climate change. And then these are two different climate scenarios, a very low emission scenario in blue and a very high emission scenario in red. And what you can see is that the uncertainty bars of future land carbon storage are massive and span from a net loss of carbon to a net gain of carbon. This is an incredibly uncertain part of Earth's carbon cycle. If you were, and I should highlight, of course, right, that numbers below zero are really likely indicating a large loss of carbon in soils and in plant biomass. And above zero is a sort of a net greening trend and a lot more carbon stored. But what I wanted to point out also is that this uncertainty is fairly unique to the terrestrial carbon cycle. If you look at the ocean carbon cycle, for example, the uncertainty bars are quite a bit narrower, and you see a lot clearer signals across climate change, future climate change scenarios. So this matters. What plants and how terrestrial ecosystems respond to a rapidly changing climate matters for the carbon cycle as well. So if we think about it, the challenge that we as a field are up against is we have this really daunting challenge of needing to scale processes that occur at maybe cell to tissue scales, like a leaf, up to a whole organism of a tree, and then ultimately a community and an ecosystem. And then we've got to scale that across ecosystems to continents and the globe. At the same time, we really also have to do this scaling in time from processes that happen over minutes, like stomatal conductance, to processes that happen over decades, like disturbance dynamics, fire, and beetle outbreaks. So ultimately, what I think are really striving for is a predictive global ecology that's based on mechanisms and first principles of plant physiology, evolution, ecology, and biogeochemistry that really captures these main global change drivers. And what I'll talk most about today are CO2 and climate stress, but also disturbances and human impacts on the landscape and how these different drivers interact. We need it to be general across spatial scales and different ecosystems, and we need it to be scalable across time in that it can capture transient, non-equilibrium, and non-linear responses in the Earth system. This is obviously a daunting task, and this is what many groups across the world are working on. Some of my vignettes are going to touch in the first section on kind of these first two. In the second section, we'll talk a little bit about some of the scaling work that we've done. And in the third section, just briefly get into some of the temporal scaling as well. Okay, so now to jump into some of the work that we have been doing in my group. We've spent quite a while over the past 5 years really thinking about how plant gas exchange is regulated by these pores on leaf surfaces called stomata. This is an electron microscope image of them, and it's a pair of cells that is controlling really the carbon and water fluxes of the biosphere, of at least the terrestrial biosphere. And we've worked a lot on stomatal optimization models and asking, how should stomata work in order to maximize fitness over long time scales? And we've been testing these stomatal optimization theories. These are kind of evolutionary theories with a huge amount of leaf gas exchange data. And this is what this graph to the right is showing you, is that for about 34 woody plant species across the world, you have the predicted stomatal conductance, how open or closed are these stomatal pores, and then the measured stomatal conductance that somebody measured in the field or in a greenhouse. And we can do really pretty remarkably well at explaining patterns based on these optimizations, and they include some key pieces of plant physiology, in particular, water transport through the plant hydraulic system. So that is a key aspect that these theories build on. we've done some controlled garden experiments where we try to ask, can these same optimizations predict some whole plant responses? So for example, here, things like photosynthesis or sap flow or water potential of plants. How well can we do at predicting whole plant responses? This was done in aspen trees in a garden setting, and at least had some preliminary success at simulating the mortality and predicting the mortality of these saplings in a garden. So this is showing you the probability of mortality on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the modeled loss of the hydraulic system. So how much, what's the percent loss of water transport that occurs in this hydraulic system? There seems to be a fairly strong threshold at this scale. Now you'll notice that there's a star and asterisks on this claim, and that in particular I want to highlight that this is really all in quite controlled settings. So here's a picture of our garden experiment, and we can really control many of the pieces of water access, of competition. You know, we've kept pests and pathogens off of these plants, and so this is really kind of a best case scenario type situation for trying to predict mortality from this water transport physiology. So the main vignette I want to talk about in this section is we set out to ask, can we use this same set of physiology to actually predict regional patterns in tree mortality? This is work that was led by a former postdoc in the lab, Martin Venturis. He's now a Marie Curie Fellow in Spain. And you don't need to worry too much about the details of this schematic. This schematic is the diagram of the plant level model that we used. And the key things that I just want to highlight are, it's going to take a lot of weather data as inputs. So things like temperature and vapor pressure deficit in the air, and rain or irrigation that happened in the garden. And it's going to take a wide number of plant functional traits, these plant physiological traits that have been typically measured at a species level, and we're going to try to apply this at a region level. So we had three main questions. What variables among really kind of stand characteristics, climate, and then this physiological stress as predicted by this plant hydraulics model? This is often called the Sperry model because it was initially developed by John Sperry here at the University of Utah. Are most important for predicting mortality. Does including a mechanistic simulation of hydraulic stress actually improve mortality predictions? And finally, kind of broadly, how well can we predict regional patterns of climate-driven mortality? So what we used was tree mortality data from about 10,000 forest inventory and analysis plots. These are long-term plots that are recensused by the US Forest Service. And we looked at 8 dominant Western US species where we know there have been pretty important drought and climate stress impacts in these species. You can see here the maps of the species, and in the black is our total plots, and then red are plots where mortality was observed. What we're going to do is we're going to simulate the drought stress in the physiological model over the measurement period using weather data. And then we're going to build statistical models of tree mortality from a big suite of predictors of stand variables like trees per hectare, density, climate variables, and then these mechanistic physiological stress variables from the Sperry model. So what we found in thinking about this first question is that, perhaps not surprisingly, stand factors were certainly the most important in predicting the absolute mortality rates. That's really probably a signal of density and of self-thinning type dynamics. But we did see climate variables and hydraulic stress variables were included as quite important in the top, and they were in the top 5 most important variables for every species. We did find that including this mechanistic hydraulic stress improved mortality prediction. So that's what this graph on the right is showing you, is this change in information criterion where a decline of about 3 or more is considered a substantial improvement. And in all species especially, but in pretty much most of the individual species, except for maybe one seed juniper, there was an improvement of including hydraulic stress, even though it was not typically a large absolute improvement. And then finally, on this third question, how well can we actually predict mortality? I have some good news and some bad news here. The good news is overall in these statistical models, prediction of mortality was decent. It explained about 52% of the variance. This is showing you observed mortality and predicted mortality versus predicted mortality. That's nice. The bad news is that really a lot of this comes from 1 or 2 species where there were strong patterns, and mortality prediction is still really hard for most species. So now I've broken this out by the 8 species now, or these other panel graphs. And what I want to call your attention to, really a lot of our ability is coming from lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, but even in some species like trembling aspen or Colorado pinyon, or single leaf pinyon, we know there have been major drought impacts on these forests and major drought driven mortality events. I've worked on aspen mortality quite a bit in the past. And yet with all of these variables, we're still only explaining about 8% of the variation in aspen mortality, despite the fact that we know that climate stress is important here. So the bad news is it's clear that mortality prediction at a regional scale is still quite hard. There are a number of things that we couldn't include in this study design due to either limitations of FIA or limitations of just data and broader understanding. A couple of really key ones, obviously, are some of the components of below ground hydrology and how much water these plants at a given plot actually have. Things like subsurface transport or bedrock water are probably quite important in these mountainous landscapes. And then, of course, biotic agents that we're not trying to model beetle impacts directly, for example. That's probably a very important piece as well. We weren't able to include those in our statistical models. And that's just a couple examples to throw out. There's probably a number of other processes that are important that we're not including in these models as well. Okay, so that's thinking about the ecophysiology of responses at tissue to tree to stand levels. And now I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing to scale up in space to get to larger ecosystems. I want to just very briefly touch on some work that some graduate students of mine have done looking at how competition influences the physiology of drought responses. So this is work that's been led by Kelly and Nikki Ziens, who are both PhD students in the lab. And just a couple of quick take-home messages. I'm not going to go into these in depth. Is that in these experiments, they did some growth chamber experiments. Competition had very large effects on plant allometry and plant growth, but more minimal effects on some of the physiological traits. And then Nikki in her study found that when plants were grown with a competitor, plants seemed to shift their stomatal strategy to be often a little bit more risky to use more water. So that's an important piece of leaf level physiology. Another very brief vignette is we've also looked at the diversity of hydraulic traits within a community and found that as you tend to get higher diversity in these hydraulic strategies, that the responsiveness of ecosystem fluxes tends to be more buffered to drought. So higher diversity in these temperate forest sites tended particularly of plant water transport traits, these plant hydraulic traits tended to be more drought buffered forests. So those are a couple brief things to touch on, but the main vignette I want to tell you in this section is trying to scale this up and think about the ecosystems. And so given that, we know that hydraulic traits are pretty important predictors of species drought responses. This has been shown in a number of systems and a few meta-analyses. And that we showed in this past study, in that study I just talked about, that the community diversity or the community composition, meaning the really community weighted traits, the means and variances of traits, matters for ecosystem drought responses. This is the motivation. Given these two pieces that have been shown in the literature, we wanted to know a couple things in this study. This was led by a former postdoc in the lab, Anna Trugman, who is now an assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara. We wanted to ask, how do these hydraulic and photosynthetic traits vary across the whole contiguous US? And I guess I'm going to show that result first before getting to these other questions. So we combined FIA with these large trait data sets, things like the xylem functional traits data set. And what's cool is we can actually then generate high resolution maps of community weighted traits. So what species are there and what are their functional traits? This is showing you the mean trait values and then the diversity. This is the range in trait values for a very common plant hydraulic trait called the P50 trait. It's the water potential at which 50% of the stem xylem has lost conductivity to water. This is kind of cool. I mean, you see the species ecological strategies jump out here, in that the mean traits, you see a huge amount of very drought tolerant species throughout the Southwest. On the diversity side, though, you can actually see the diversity of strategies of plant physiology in the Southeast, for example, and in parts of the Southwest, like where you have co-occurring species of pinyon and juniper, for instance, that have very different physiology. And then there are parts, particularly in the northern states, where the range in traits is much lower. You have a lot more similarly, physiologically similar species co-occurring. We published these high resolution trait diversity maps and encourage folks to check them out and use them if you're interested. The other two questions we wanted to know, though, once we had built these maps, is we could start to ask then, how have community trait composition, how has it changed over the past 20 years? The sort of standardized FIA data set really starts around the year 2000. And what are some of the drivers of these trait changes? What are the demographic drivers among recruitment, growth, and mortality? And what are some of the climate drivers of these trait changes? We're trying to quantify something that we can think of as a trait velocity. So this is a change in traits over time. So if we have this graph here showing you, if you have a given community weighted mean trait, so that's the kind of biomass or basal area weighted trait, let's say something like maximum photosynthetic rate. And it was measured in the first survey in FIA in 2005, and then it was remeasured, well, the FIA plot was remeasured in 2015 in a second survey. Let's say this is our initial stand census, and different color trees are different species. There's sort of several different scenarios of how these community weighted traits can change. You can have a community weighted trait change through differential mortality, where in this scenario, you can see that the dark blue species has differentially died off, and thus the community composition is really much more heavily weighted towards the other remaining species. Or alternately, we can see these community weighted traits change through the kind of combination of growth and recruitment. We combined these two for this analysis. So in this scenario, you can see we maybe have a new orange tree here, and maybe these orange trees did differentially better than the others. And this is this change through growth and recruitment. So what we found in analyzing FIA data and combining it with these traits is that across the US, we see this general pattern that forests have tended to get slightly more drought tolerant. That's mainly quantified via this P50 trait getting slightly more negative, meaning plants, we see a lot more species that can tolerate more negative water potentials and drought stress. The other big finding was this seemed to be really much more strongly driven by differential mortality rates rather than differential growth and recruitment rates. And that's what this figure is showing. This is a little bit complicated of figure because these are coefficients of statistical models. I've broken it apart by total across the US, angiosperm or gymnosperm dominated plots, and then Western or Eastern forests. And a negative mortality coefficient here, which is where most of these points are, and every dot is a different statistical model where we made different assumptions to look at how sensitive the results were. A negative coefficient on this top panel is showing us that, that the changes in P50 are, the declines in P50 are driven by elevated mortality. So higher mortality is leading to more drought tolerant communities. And then the final piece is looking at climate drivers. We tended to see that really drought or aridity, as calculated in this metric called climatic water deficit, was one of the largest signals, drivers of these trait changes. And this was predominant in kind of Western forests and gymnosperm dominated forests. It's interesting that actually some of the larger signals in mortality showed up in angiosperm forests and a little bit more clearly in the east than in the west. Okay, now to change gears a little bit and move towards the final vignette that I want to tell you about our work is thinking about scaling in time. So once we've looked at these impacts over a certain window of time, how can we scale this out to decadal type projections? And if we want to think about moving towards long-term predictions of how forests are going to respond based on these fundamental mechanisms, one question that we wanted to pose here is, does a forest response to multiple droughts differ from a response to a single individual drought? Mostly for very understandable logistical reasons, the vast majority of the ecophysiological literature has focused on a single drought event, a single experiment or a single natural drought event. Now, part of the reason why this is a very complicated question is that there's a whole suite of mechanisms that could increase resilience and a suite of mechanisms that could decrease resilience at a whole range of different spatial scales. So at a tree scale, we might think that shifts in allocation, maybe towards more root area or less leaf area, shifts in physiology like these functional traits, and many others could actually increase resilience over time. This is an acclimation response or a phenotypic plasticity response. And actually every single one of these mechanisms I'm going to mention, there is some evidence for this occurring, at least in some instances in the literature. At a more community or ecosystem scale, we could see shifts after an initial drought in terms of whole ecosystem water demand. And like I just talked about in the previous section, we could of course see shifts in species composition and what forests are there, what species are there in the forest. On the resilience decreasing side, at a tree level, we certainly have seen examples of unrepaired tissue damage, like loss to this hydraulic system, or maybe infection from a pest or a pathogen. That's certainly something that could decrease resilience to a subsequent stress. And at an ecosystem scale, we have seen examples of a lot of these microclimate feedbacks and land-atmosphere interactions, also pest and population dynamics and larger pest dynamics at the landscape scale. These are things that could decrease resilience to sequential multiple climate extremes, multiple droughts. And of course, it's worth noting, this matters a lot for climate change because climate change is going to also increase not only the severity of droughts in many regions, but also the frequency. We're expecting to see, many more, let's say the shortening of the drought return interval, meaning we see a lot more droughts in a given decade or several decades. So what we did, we wanted to tackle this at a couple different scales and with a couple different data sets, is we looked at growth using tree ring data from the International Tree Ring Data Bank. And this is about 1,200 chronologies, pretty heavily concentrated in North America and Europe. We looked at mortality from FIA plots that met our, we had a couple requirements for plots to be included. So there are about 50,000 plots that met that requirement. And then we wanted to look at an ecosystem metric of canopy water content. And this comes from satellites that sense the vegetation optical depth. And these are global since about 2002 or so. We're going to look at drought using a very standardized drought metric called the SPEI drought metric. I mentioned that earlier in the talk. This is a pretty standard drought metric. What's important to note is that it's all been for every grid cell, it's been set to a Gaussian distribution. And so you can kind of compare the same drought severity over space and mostly over time. So we can look at a -2 standard deviation drought over space. So what we did is we used that drought data to find regions that had at least 2 droughts during the measurement interval of tree rings, FIA, or satellites. We looked at a range of drought severities going from a -1.2 SPEI to a -2 SPEI. That's basically a moderate to severe drought. A -1.2 drought occurs about every 8 to 10 years, whereas a -2 drought is a 2 sigma drought, and that occurs about every 50 years on random draws. And then we're going to calculate the tree or the ecosystem anomalies to an initial drought versus a subsequent drought, being very careful to pair everything for similar drought severity. So we're making sure that the initial and the subsequent droughts had very similar drought severities, and thus the difference between initial and subsequent is not driven by differences in drought severity. Okay, so let's talk about tree rings first. Thinking about the growth impacts, this comes from ITRDB. And you can see that this is showing you now going from moderate on the right to very severe droughts on the left. Of course, tree growth goes down during drought, but it's only at really severe droughts here at this SPEI of less than -2, where we see a more negative impact of a subsequent drought. At all these other drought categories, they're pretty similarly harmful between an initial and a subsequent drought. We parsed this apart a little bit more to understand what is driving this. And now I'm actually plotting the difference. Oh, I should have mentioned this, sorry. The light red bars are the initial drought and the dark red bars are the subsequent drought. For the next graph, I'm going to show you the difference between the light red and the dark red bars just for this -2 category. So this is on these graphs below 0 shows us that the subsequent drought was substantially worse. It impacted tree growth more negatively. And in the above 0, the initial drought had a more negative impact. We broke it apart by the main taxa, and you can see that really pines jump out as being strongly negatively impacted by a second drought. And this shows up by clade as well, thinking about angiosperms versus gymnosperms, that gymnosperms are really hit a lot harder by subsequent droughts, whereas some of the angiosperm species maybe even show a slight acclimation response where they are maybe slightly less negatively impacted by a second drought. In terms of mortality, so this is the same, this left-hand graph is the same initial subsequent drought, and then this right-hand graph is the difference between the two broken out by clade. The patterns here were a lot more complex, a lot more mixed, and a lot more statistically weak. So I'm not going to go into depth here on trying to interpret these patterns. Really, they were a lot more kind of complicated and not nearly as clear. But when we get back to the satellite, the ecosystem canopy water content, really clear patterns jump out here. So this is, again, this same initial versus subsequent drought going from moderate to severe droughts. And you can see here a really clear pattern where there's much larger negative impacts of canopy water content of second droughts compared to first droughts for the same drought severity. When we look at it by biome, we can break it out by biome, and 2 biomes really jump out here: tropical moist broadleaf forests and temperate conifer forests. And I feel like what's really cool about this is actually this temperate zone pattern recapitulates and matches the pattern we see in tree rings as well, in that the temperate broadleaf forests tend to really look like the angiosperm patterns we saw in tree rings, and the temperate coniferous forests really match the gymnosperm patterns we saw in our tree ring sample, where subsequent droughts have a much more negative impact than initial droughts. This is what it looks like over space. We can make these global maps because these satellites are picking up this canopy water content globally. And here, gray colors are where we've masked for non-forests. And red colors are where the subsequent drought had a bigger impact, a more negative impact on canopy water content than the initial drought. Blue colors are where the initial drought had a more negative impact, and white is where they were pretty equal. Or actually, sorry, white is where there weren't actually two droughts during the measurement period that met our criteria. That's what white is. I should be clear about that. A couple things that pop out globally in thinking about this. I think swaths of the Amazon really jump out, and this is particularly relevant because the Amazon has had really 3 massive droughts since 2005. And so that seems to be showing up in this analysis here. So just to summarize this vignette, on average, forests seem to get more vulnerable to a subsequent drought after going through an initial drought. We tend to see declines in resilience rather than increases in resilience, particularly in there, and there are really strong biome and taxon level differences. We see it in particularly in gymnosperm dominated forests. And then there are some regions that pop out globally with multiple severe droughts, like the Amazon, and they show up as more vulnerable in this canopy water content. We are speculating that maybe this is because this drought severity, these really 3 1 in a century or more severity of droughts, might exceed the resilience mechanisms of those forests. So to summarize all of the pieces, all of the 3 different areas that I've talked about today, hopefully I've convinced you that really mechanistic prediction of climate stress and how it affects plant physiology is really crucial and also a really exciting and powerful tool. Really using some of these current models and plant physiological traits, we can start to scale from up to ecosystems and continents, although this is still pretty challenging, particularly for something like tree mortality. And finally, scaling over time, these long-term responses are really going to hinge on multiple and interacting climate stresses. And crucially, what we've shown in this last vignette that I've told you is that these multiple responses can actually differ substantially from a response to a single stress event. So just to, in the last couple of minutes, to touch on a few future things we're thinking about. Trying to think about what are ways we can try to fill in and advance this understanding of a predictive global ecology that's scaling over space and time. We've recently started an effort that we're calling the Forest Resilience Lab, trying to quantify, for at least in the US initially, future climate projections of forest carbon stock potential and really rigorous estimates of the risks, some of the main climate sensitive risks. Particularly, we're focusing on fire, drought, and biotic agents. This is a figure that we just synthesized of historical fire trends over time. And we think there's a really urgent need for this ecological and carbon cycle information to really guide not only land management, but a huge emerging interest in nature-based climate solutions, carbon finance, and carbon offset type markets that are really not adequately are really not based on a lot of current and rigorous scientific data at the moment. And we want to make all of these maps, data sets, and tools publicly available to really inform a whole range of stakeholders and let folks download and use the data in their own applications to guide management and policy. So with that, I want to thank a huge number of collaborators that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. I want to thank the folks in my lab who've led in a number of these projects. And I want to thank some of the funding that's supported this work. And finally, thank you for attending. I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So we have, I think, until 12:15, is that right?
Yeah,
You're
that's right.
available for about
Yeah.
15 minutes for questions, and unless somebody else is going to jump in, I'm glad to moderate that. So if folks want to either type things in the chat, I can read them, or we could probably just try to have folks jump right in. I'm also going to put in the chat a link if you want to sign up. Dr. Anderegg, as far as I know, is still available from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern time for individual meetings. Is that right? So we have a Google Drive if you're interested to sign up for a 15 or 30-minute slot. I'm putting that in the chat right now.
Great.
I have a question. Thank you for a great talk. And questions about the Piedmont. One of your maps, you showed, I think, increased trait diversity in the Southeast. And just looking at the map, it looks like that was concentrated in the Piedmont up through several states. What is the background for that? The sort of community assembly, evolutionary history of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really great question. Thanks for that. And I am certainly not the expert there. There are probably folks on this call who have more expertise there. My understanding, just briefly from looking at the FIA data that we're looking at in those plots, is that seems to be a pretty big oaks and pines type difference. So this seems to be that, pines and oaks have quite different hydraulic physiology, and that's where you have co-occurrence of those broad clades is where you tend to see this big diversity in that trait. Now, of course, there are rooting depth differences. There's a whole range of other traits that differ too. So this is just one slice through physiology of a community.
Thank you.
I have a question, maybe in the spirit of the graduate seminar. Your work crosses so many different scales, and it looks like in terms of lab work or field work that you do, that mostly focuses on the plant and the leaf level. But at the broader scales, up to the continental and the global scale, you're using a lot of publicly available data sets from FIA to satellites, and so you've touched on a lot of those things. Could you maybe just speak for a minute about the importance of those publicly available data sets to your research program, and maybe where you see opportunities for students thinking about future projects and things where, not to lead you too much, but I think there are a lot of really rich data sets out there, and we probably have more data than we know what to do with. So maybe you could just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I agree completely that these publicly available data sets, whether they're published by individual research groups and contributors in something like the FluxNet data set, where people run flux towers and publish it and share it, or funded by a federal or state agency, right? So FIA is a great example there. These are just incredibly important to the types of work that we and many folks do. So I think it's really kind of incumbent upon us to try to contribute to those and add to those. And when we collect tree ring cores or set up flux towers, we try to make sure we add to those data sets. Same is actually true of functional traits. So a lot of these physiological traits, we've really benefited enormously from everyone publishing and sharing their data. I think there are a huge number of underutilized large-scale data sets, and FIA is certainly one. I think one that folks should keep an eye on coming out and really rolling out is the NEON network, and some of the kind of syntheses and compilations of flux data sets. So there's the FluxNet 2015, but a new one flux data set. There's new flux ecosystem flux data sets that are being rolled out as well. And then, on the satellite side, the remote sensors have done an incredible job making all that data available. And there's just so much that we can get out of even classic satellite data sets like Landsat and MODIS, but even some of these newer ones, thinking about solar-induced fluorescence, this NIRV, near-infrared reflectance. I've gotten a lot out of this vegetation optical depth and thinking about canopy water content. I think there's a huge amount of potential. Maybe the final thing I'll mention is I always encourage students to try to work at multiple scales and try to understand mechanisms at scales. And maybe that's, different projects or different chapters have an experiment on a tree level and then a larger scale analysis of inventory or satellites. But also I think there's a huge potential for trying to combine data sets across these scales and really mesh plot level data to satellites or flux towers to satellites. And there's some challenges, definitely some pitfalls there, but I feel like that's going to be where, again, NEON I think will be a powerful tool too. That's going to be where I think there's a lot of cool science that happens in the next decade.
Great, thank you.
One slight challenge, one of the challenges there too is that plenty of data sets have some uncertainty associated with them and uncertainty in space and time. And FIA in particular has this fuzzing where the true plot locations they generally don't release. And so that's a challenge in trying to match it with other data sets. Anyway, there's long and complicated reasons for that, but it's worth being aware that there are some barriers to scaling and matching data sets too.
Yeah, and so numerical methods and statistics, like everything, become really important for the types of work that you do, and especially as we go out into the forecasting realm and looking out into the future. I think it really emphasizes the importance of being able to propagate uncertainty properly and stuff like that. So do you use a lot of Bayesian methods for that type of work, or do you have favorite sort of statistical worlds that you live in?
Yeah, actually, so that's something we're getting a little bit more into. We haven't historically done a lot of Bayesian work, but I think this error propagation is really, and uncertainty quantification is really crucial. And so that's something that I'm learning more about, and I think we'd like to use more. I think another technique that we tend to use is really multi-model ensembles. And so if we think about some of these mechanistic models, how can we use sort of this ensemble of opportunity across different models and different parameter sets, and looking at the kind of both the parameter and the structural uncertainty across models. It's a tough challenge, but I think we've got more and more tools to start to do that.
I'm going to keep talking and asking questions until somebody jumps in. And I have plenty, so I'm glad to do that. I wanted to go back all the way to the beginning when you started with the Keeling curve, which I think is such a fantastic teaching tool for understanding, as you showed us, to how that curve both includes information about anthropogenic emissions of CO2, but also the role of the terrestrial biosphere in taking carbon out of the atmosphere. At Clemson, being in the Southeast, where we have very productive forests, we're getting a lot more questions rapidly in the last year or so about the potential for forests to provide natural climate solutions and take carbon out of the atmosphere. I've been showing that figure for years because I think that looking at the amplitude, the annual cycle of, as you said, basically turning the entire northern hemisphere forest on every year only draws that curve down by a couple parts per million. And that is the potential of the entire northern hemisphere to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so when we ask about, afforestation and planting trees and managing differently, I think that figure keeps us honest about the sort of the true role of forests in that total global carbon balance. So I guess to try to turn this into a question, I mean, are you, and you showed the uncertainty bars from the IPCC, what's your personal opinion on the potential for forests to provide natural climate solutions over the next 30 years, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. I'm somewhat mixed in that certainly there are going to be scenarios and places where there's some potential to better manage forests and maybe reforest. I think afforestation is probably dodgy for a number of reasons. It's what I would like to see is a lot better. I think we need to temper that optimism quite a bit in that in the most wildly optimistic versions where we finance that sort of nature-based climate solutions immensely, the best possible case scenario that we get is, thinking to that classic climate wedges where we need 7 to 10 climate wedges to solve the climate problem, is we get one climate wedge. So this could be a moderate contributor. It could be up to 10% really of a contributor in the best case scenario, done very, very well. And unfortunately, a number of these things are not being done terribly well right now in terms of the risks that they face from climate change and the biophysical impacts. Is it a net cooling or a net warming? And then the additionality and leakage that are, these kind of key policy pieces of forests for climate solutions. So I think there are definitely going to be places where we should be investing in forests, and we should invest in forests for many reasons that are not climate related, whether it's biodiversity, ecosystem services, water, things like that. I think I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to solve a lot of the climate problem, because in the best case scenario, we only get about 10% done well. So it's one arrow in the quiver, and I think it's an arrow that can't distract us from what we really need to do, which is reduce fossil fuel emissions. That's got to be most of the arrows in the quiver.
That's right. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so there's one question in the chat now from Megan Keating. She asks, love to hear about Bayesian work more generally. Are there certain forests, for example, Northwest old growth, that face bigger challenges with persistence? Is there a focus on those in your work, or do you prefer to look more broadly at all forest types?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our work to date, the forests that face the largest challenges with persistence tend to be in the Western US and tend to be most heavily in the Southwestern US, with the exception of pine beetle outbreaks in the Northern Rockies. So what we've seen in both fire, drought, and some of the beetle modeling work, and we actually have some work where we've built these using FIA data, and that's under review right now. Really, things look okay in the Southeast. The risks look pretty low in the Great Lakes and Northeast. And then the risks look incredibly high in like California through Colorado, basically that swath of the Southwest. Old growth in the Northwest is a little bit an edge case in that it's hard to know for sure. And a lot of it can hinge on some of these biotic agents that were not terribly well constrained. I guess one thing I'll point out actually is we, in thinking about the sum total of these major climate sensitive risks of direct climate stress, of fire, and of biotic agents, we have probably far and away the most models and understanding of fire. We have kind of a moderate and intermediate understanding of drought risks or climate stress risks. And then I think some of the biggest monsters in the closet, the biggest uncertainties that we don't have very good models of, are these biotic agent type models. What's going to be the next mountain pine beetle that just tears through forests? Or will, how much will the mountain pine beetle resurge in the Western US? Those have had massive carbon cycle impacts, and our ability to predict in a future climate of the biotic agents is just so much more uncertain than drought or fire. So I think that's a big piece that as a research community, I really hope we can dig into in the next couple of years and make progress.
Great, thank you so much. So it's 12:15, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you again to our speakers so much for joining us and for a fantastic seminar. And thank you everyone for joining. Again, if you'd like to meet with Dr. Anderegg in the afternoon after 2 o'clock, the link in the chat will take you to the sign up for that. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, take care.
Bye.